Welcome to Global Connections with Robert Siegel, presented by the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. Our monthly Leaders Forum addresses vital issues facing society, the economy, real estate, medicine, technology, and science. My name is Dr. Joshua Plow. I'm the Executive Director of American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, a 501c3 National American charitable organization based in New York City. We at AFRMC represent Israel's premier hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petah Tikva and Greater Tel Aviv, the leading institution named in honor of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. The hospital is a model of coexistence, as it serves 1 million patients annually from all ethnic and religious backgrounds with the same compassionate care. Please support our mission. Join our community of friends. Visit American Friends of Rabin Medical Center online, AFRMC.org, via our website and social media outlets, on Twitter and Instagram, LinkedIn and YouTube, and on our Facebook page and discussion group. Our host and moderator for Global Connections is Robert Siegel, former host of All Things Considered on National Public Radio for 31 years. Over the course of an hour each month, Global Connections features guests who Robert Siegel interviews as they explore important issues in our world. Today's Global Connections topic is white supremacy, how big a threat, how to conquer it. Thank you to our very special guests, Professor Kathleen Belew of the University of Chicago, Jonathan Greenblatt, National Director and CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, and Professor Lawrence Rosenthal, Chair of the Berkeley Center for Right-Wing Studies at the University of California. And now, Global Connections with Robert Siegel.
Thank you, Josh. On January 6th, when a mob of insurrectionists attacked the Capitol building and forced the Congress to suspend counting electoral ballots, there were familiar symbols of ideas and movements that some of them represented. Some carried Confederate flags. One wore a T-shirt advertising Camp Auschwitz. A group in tactical gear moved with coordinated military precision. White supremacy movements and self-styled militias were brandishing signs of their identity with abandon, evidently confident of the support of the man they had come to Washington to rally for, the outgoing president. How strong are these movements and what are their origins? What's being done to limit their influence and what more could be done? These are questions for our three panelists. We'll hear in a short while from Jonathan Greenblatt of the Anti-Defamation League. But first, we're going to hear from two scholars of the American far right. Professor Lawrence Rosenthal is chair and lead researcher of the Berkeley Center for Right-Wing Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. He has taught in both the sociology and Italian studies departments at UC Berkeley. His study of Italian politics began with his study of fascism. Dr. Rosenthal is the author of Empire of Resentment, Populism's Toxic Embrace of Nationalism. It tracks developments on the American right since the rise of the Tea Party. Larry Rosenthal, welcome to our panel. It's good to see you.
Good to see you. Thank you.
Since the early months of the pandemic, we've been hearing on these monthly panels about the very unusual year that 2020 was, and January 6th, 2021 added to that sense of these very problematic and remarkable times. As a scholar of the far right, I want you to give us a sense of how 2020 figured, what it felt like for someone who is a member of some far right extremist group.
There were a series of major demonstrations and movements. And if you think about the right-wing militia in the US over the course of the past 30, 40 years, there are essentially two currents. One current is white supremacy, and the other is extreme anti-government. And two things which were extraordinary happened. The first were the anti-lockdown demonstrations. They were particularly strong in places like Michigan, where eventually the legislature was taken over by armed men. But the conditions, the COVID restrictions around getting together, asking people to wear masks, asking people to shelter in place. It was as though these went to the heart of the grievances of this movement, of the anti-government movement. And so the anti-government militias, the militias were kind of quiescent after Charlottesville, which we don't get into right now, but sort of was a moment when the right-wing militias had great expectations and it collapsed. But in 2020, the anti-government militias were mobilized around anti-lockdown. Mm-hmm. And then immediately after that, no break in between, there were the George Floyd demonstrations, and then there were the demonstrations against the George Floyd demonstrations, the people who came out, like the Proud Boys and so forth, to confront the demonstrators, the George Floyd demonstrators, in the same way that the anti-lockdown went to the heart of the grievances of the anti-government current of the militia right. This went to the heart of the white nationalist grievances on and that current on the extreme right, on the militia right. So
on the militia right, you're saying it was all engines were everything was go. All the grievances were awakened and were, for example,
and mobilized in this extraordinary sequence with no interval in between. And then they were mobilized first around, it's as though these two sets of grievances became themselves resolved around the election campaign of Donald Trump. I mean, if you think about Donald Trump's, the major narrative of Donald Trump's electoral campaign, it was more or less Antifa and Black Lives Matter are coming to get you. And all that stands in between are me and the people who support me, including the militias. This replaced the 2016 narrative, major narrative of the Trump campaign back then, which was immigrants are coming to get you. And so this new set of scapegoats was such that both of these currents of the right-wing militia, who had been mobilized in their particulars, could come together around first the candidacy, the re-election candidacy, then the beginning of Donald Trump's his insistence that the election had been stolen, and finally, after that the election would be stolen, and then afterwards that it was stolen, and they became, there was the famous shout out during the Trump's debate with Joe Biden.
Stand back and stand by. Stand back and stand by.
And the Proud Boys immediately responded and took this on almost as a motto, put it on their uniforms and so forth. So the connection between these newly mobilized currents of the militia, their connection that they felt with Trump, and Trump, who would say, go home, we love you, it was a mutual connection.
Yeah.
That was kind of the third of the events of 2020, which led on to January 6th.
You mentioned Charlottesville. I just want to return to that for a moment, because when we spoke earlier, the way you described it to me, Charlottesville for the far right was a failure. It didn't achieve what the right-wing protesters who went there tried to accomplish.
No, if you remember what it was called the Unite the Right rally. And really what they were trying to do was create a unified right-wing militia. The organizers of it, and if you remember, it seems like a while ago, this was 2017, we weren't talking about the Proud Boys so much, or the Oath Keepers, we were talking about the alt-right. The leader of the alt-right, Richard Spencer, one of the organizers of Charlottesville, he was explicit that in his view, the polarization in American politics had reached the level that he called Weimar, meaning the period after World War I, the brief period of parliamentary democracy, 12 years or so, until the Nazis took it over. And that in that period, what he meant was what we're going to get is fighting on the streets between an extreme left and an extreme right, and people are going to have to choose one side or the other. He was explicit about that. And the image of a unified right-wing militia, was foreshadowed in those marches at night with the torches and the chants like, "You will not replace us." But afterwards, there was internecine fighting. Places like Amazon took them. They could no longer sell things on Amazon, and they were indicted in state court in Virginia and federal court. And so and I think it's fair to say that the American public didn't really take very well to explicit Nazi propaganda.
Well, then let me just ask you very briefly to wrap up. Given that from the time from Charlottesville through to the end of 2020 and January 6th of this year, we've seen events that have been as inspiring to the far right as they could possibly be. Is the picture that we get of these white power movements or these militias or whatever we want to call them, are they stronger than you would have thought they were before this sequence of events? Are they about as strong? Are they weaker than you thought they would have been?
Well, they have this extraordinary moment. The militias were peripheral. They were called the fringe. Mm-hmm. They were peripheral to national politics until they weren't in the 20s and 30s. But after that, they had some place in regional politics. You could get David Duke running for office in Louisiana and things like that. But on the national level, they had no role, and actually very little participated in national or electoral politics, as Kathleen Belew points out. But that changed in 2015. It changed because essentially someone at the level of presidential politics was talking their language. And so they were historically mobilized to re-enter to mainstream or national politics during the first Donald Trump campaign. And so if your question is, was I surprised? No. Once they had found themselves a role in mainstream politics, mm-hmm. once they had found that they were not consigned to this fringe that they had been in for decades, the capacity and the willingness to pursue that moment, combined with Donald Trump's reciprocity to that did not make what happened essentially on January 6th, however shocking it was, did not make it unforeseeable.
Larry Rosenthal, thanks. And stay with us because the Q&A portion is coming up. Our next panelist is Kathleen Belew, who's an authority on the white power movement. She's an assistant professor of history at the University of Chicago. Professor Belew is the author of the book, Bring the War Home, the White Power Movement and Paramilitary America. In that book, she traces the roots of the modern so-called militia movement to the Vietnam War and Vietnam veterans who believed that the anti-communist cause in Vietnam was sold out by liberal elites. Professor Belew, welcome to our panel.
Thank you very much for having me.
And I want to try to sum up your thesis. Tell me if I've done a fair job. There were far right wingers who came home from Vietnam feeling sold out, disrespected, estranged from the mores of 1970s America, trained to kill communists over there, they said, and determined to keep on doing it here, including the communists who really ran the government in Washington. Do I have it about right?
That's exactly right. The only thing I would add is that group ended up including a whole bunch of people who did not serve in the Vietnam War, but nevertheless took up the war as their main performative sort of battle cry.
Vietnam was the first major conflict fought with an integrated army, with U.S. integrated armed forces. How important was being white to being part of this militia movement that was tied, at least in spirit, to service in Vietnam?
Very important. And this is one of the things I'd like to clarify too about the nature of my argument related to veteran activity. So the veterans who joined white power groups after the Vietnam War were a very small number of returning veterans as a whole. If we were going to go write a history of the impact of the Vietnam War on the men who fought there, this would not be the primary story. But these veterans did have an outsized impact on the groups that I study, in large part because they came home with a whole bunch of skills that dramatically escalated the casualties that these groups could carry out back in the United States. These include weapons expertise, explosives expertise, training, tactical expertise, and more. And also, they sort of created this story about the Vietnam War that was open to a whole bunch of other people that could then be mobilized in a very opportunistic fashion in sort of the broad paramilitary social and cultural contexts of the 80s and 90s.
You should explain. You've documented this thesis with information that really wasn't available or seen much until pretty recently. A lot of it is FBI material.
Yes, that's right. I do a lot with previously classified FBI documents. There are also many other archival sources in the book, ranging from the materials produced by white power activists themselves to the in-depth journalism of the movement as it was happening. And then there are a number of very important court cases that include not only the things that legal historians look for, like the record of decision, but also very detailed records about how many guns were seized at what point, how people thought about their involvement in the movement, the kinds of testimony people gave in different moments and things like that.
Vietnam was a long time ago. And in the past 20 years, the U.S. has sent troops to wars far away, sometimes with unclear aims or indeterminate ends. Has the allure of the white supremacist militia, has the attraction to it, albeit a small number of veterans, has it carried over to veterans of Afghanistan and Iraq?
Absolutely. We see outsized percentages of veteran and active duty troop involvement in actions like January 6th, and even groups like the Oath Keepers, which are explicitly oriented around recruiting veteran and active duty membership as well as police officers. So one interesting thing to look at is that we have a very good historical record of the rise and fall of these groups because the Klan provides a good model over a sustained period of time with dramatic surges and decreases in membership. And it turns out that over the course of that group's activity, the best factor for predicting a membership surge is not poverty or populism or immigration or, massive civil rights gains or things like this. The best predictive factor is the aftermath of warfare. So that made me wonder when I began the project if this was really going to be a Rambo story about people who just can't turn off the violence of warfare and continue it at home. And certainly that's the narrative in a lot of places, and there are cases of veterans doing that. But I think the takeaway for me has been that it's that, but it's also that all of American society, as sociologists have documented, all of us are more violent in the aftermath of warfare. And that phenomenon runs across gender, across age group. It includes people who did and did not serve. So I tend to think that this is more about the sort of ricochet effects of war, as well as the way that these groups are deeply opportunistic and are very skilled at kind of shifting their methods to capitalize on opportunity. And the aftermath of warfare is one of those huge windows of opportunity. Now, we were speaking before the program about how I no longer teach, my undergraduate students no longer remember 9/11. The flip side of that is we've been at war their entire life. What that does to this phenomenon, I don't think we know yet. Whether it is going to be longer and more drawn out, but maybe smaller, whether we're going to see a delay and a spike, I don't know. But I think it would be tremendously naive of us to think that there won't be an after effect.
The chilling feeling I had in reading your book, and in saying, how did I not see this connection when I was reading newscasts and stories about these new self-styled militias cropping up around the country. But the chilling feeling I had was soldiers come back from bleeding for their country in a losing war effort, form into uniformed groups, and fight in the streets with others. It sounds like Munich in the 1920s. It sounds like the very same circumstances that gave rise to Nazism.
Yes, and many of these activists are neo-Nazis and take up those symbols and that history in a very deliberate way. And I think the other factor here is that the way that this movement works from the late 1970s forward, this is the same movement that we are encountering in the present, is that it is very diverse in all ways but race. So this movement brought together Klansmen, neo-Nazis, skinheads, some parts of the militia movement, radical tax resistors, followers of Christian identity, which is a kind of spin-off of British Israelism, and brought all of these groups together across huge cultural obstacles, across all regions of the countries, across all class positions, educational background, et cetera, because they had this very deep sense of emergency and betrayal. Part of that has to do with Vietnam. Part of it has to do with visions of the end of the world. But all of it is it really feels like a no exit kind of an ideology. Like you can't, it's very difficult for people to kind of de-escalate from this belief system and de-radicalize out, because the whole thing is motivated by this sense that what many of us have thought of as a moment of peaceful demographic transformation, when a town or a state or the nation will no longer be majority white, these activists see that as tantamount to racial annihilation. That's an apocalyptic danger. And because of that, it infuses everything with this very deeply felt sense of emergency and end times belief that I think is very alarming to recognize in our current political discussions.
And I'm just curious. Do you feel that these movements, as you've studied them, do you have a sense that they buy into the lost cause of the stolen election myth as something that will hold them together?
So I think this is one of the great unanswered questions. And this is where I have to flag that I'm a historian. So my area of expertise is really in 1996 and earlier. But I will say that, so in the period of my study, most of the activists I talk about did not, well, I mean, the movement as a whole believed that the kinds of social change that it wanted could never be achieved through mainstream politics. Part of that is because they want really radical stuff. Like they're talking about a return to slavery, a return to Jim Crow, forced exile of Jews and people of color from the nation, all kinds of variety of ethno-state. It's a very violent movement. And this is one of the reasons I think it helps to call it white power instead of white nationalism, because the nation in this movement that is envisioned is not the United States. The nation is the Aryan nation. It's a fundamentally anti-democratic and anti-American movement. But because they think mainstream politics will never work, they are really using things like the David Duke presidential run, for instance, as publicity stunts to get recruitment actions going. I don't think very many people in this movement think that incremental political change or even dramatic political change was ever going to deliver what they wanted. Now, arguably, that pendulum is not in the same place as it was in the 80s, in part because Donald Trump's administration normalized a lot of white nationalist belief and policymaking, and in part because white nationalism has made inroads in political parties, not only in the United States, but elsewhere. Because of that, I think there is this big question mark for me about how revolutionary this movement remains. In the period of my study, it was not at all interested in democratic change. It was interested in overthrowing the nation. I think that accelerationist and anti-democratic impulse is still a huge part of what's happening. And for those actors, I think that support of President Trump isn't heartfelt, it's opportunistic. It's a strategy on the way to a different thing. But there are people, especially in the newer radicalized parts of the Trump base, who do express both belief in this kind of ideology and strong support of Donald Trump. So I think that's a new dynamic in the movement.
Well, Kathleen Belew, thank you very much. And for the questions that you can't yet answer as a historian, I'll make a note to call you back in 30 years. But,
okay.
But first, we'll come back to you in 10 minutes when we take questions from our audience. Our next panelist is Jonathan Greenblatt, who is National Director and CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, which has investigated and publicized acts of anti-Semitism and other brands of hatred for over a century. That has entailed infiltrating groups like the Ku Klux Klan and pro-Nazi German-American groups. Nowadays, it involves monitoring the statements of contemporary hate groups on social media, on mainstream platforms, and on obscure platforms favored by the far right. Before leading ADL, Jonathan Greenblatt served in the White House as Special Assistant to President Barack Obama and Director of the Office of Social Innovation and Civic Participation. And we're very happy to have him as our guest today. Jonathan Greenblatt, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
First, ADL has some unsettling news today about the number of posters and flyers that promote racial or religious or other kinds of hatred that they went up way up last year. What's the news?
Yes, Robert. So the ADL is the oldest anti-hate organization in the world. We've been focusing on fighting anti-Semitism and racism and all forms of hate and extremism for over 100 years. And one of the things that we do is we track different elements of sort of these extremist movements, including specifically the white supremacist segment of the far right. And we look at their propaganda activities. And today we released a report that found that over the course of 2020, we saw a 90+% increase year over year in white supremacist propaganda activities. By this, I mean flyering, stickering, pamphleting. It's like dropping banners on the overpasses of highways, events, demonstrations. Basically, the number almost doubled year over year. There were so many events, 5,125. It's an average of 14 incidents a day. They span 49 states all across America, with the exception of Hawaii. And, much of this white supremacist propaganda wasn't sort of KKK images, if you will, or swastikas. No, they were very frequently sort of messages that were evocative of a sort of pseudo-patriotism, like America First, or United We Stand, or Reclaim America, and so on and so forth. But we found a minimum, at least like 30 different hate groups behind these messages. And it doesn't take much, Robert, to sort of peel back the sticker, if you will, and you see the toxic ideologies of these groups.
But does that near doubling of this kind of information and the large number of groups that you find behind it, does that mean that the number of white supremacists in America increased a lot in 2020, or that more of the same group were activated to do things?
Both of those things can be true at the same time, and there's more. So I think, number one, we have certainly seen over the past 4 years a radical increase in the recruiting efforts of far-right extremists. Some of that was explicit recruiting, like for the first time in recent years, we've seen white supremacist groups tabling at college, organizational fairs. We've seen them showing up at farmers markets, unusual places where you wouldn't expect. They've suddenly felt emboldened and energized to sort of come out of the woodwork. So that's one thing. I think a second issue that's very real is the existing groups themselves, again, in this environment, as Professor Belew was brilliantly kind of explaining a few minutes ago, they have felt that this environment is conditioned to their kinds of conspiracy theories. So they felt increasingly comfortable sharing in new ways that they wouldn't have before. And frankly, the pandemic gave them a terrific kind of narrative. From the president blaming it on foreigners and the Chinese people and whatnot, to the accusations among some that somehow the Jewish people were responsible for it, either concocting the virus or singularly spreading the virus or profiting from it. These are the kind of environmental kind of influencers, if you will, that these hate groups really thrive on. So number one, there are more of them than before. Number two, they feel increasingly comfortable in this environment. And then the third thing that I think is real is over the course of 2020, frankly, again, it started at the top with the president and it filtered down among his fellow travelers. But the demonization of different communities, the denigration of our institutions, and really the delegitimization of the democratic process itself, these weren't dog whistles to the far right. They were bullhorns that they heard. And I think as we talk about and try to put into some context, January the 6th, we describe that as an act of mass radicalization.
Yeah.
Where you had extremism normalized in a way, Robert, which would have been unimaginable just a few years ago. But the last several years have actually set the stage for that. Honestly, the most predictable terror attack in America.
I'd like to pursue that point with you precisely. I want you to reconcile two conflicting images. First, FBI Director Christopher Wray testifies before Congress that after January 6th, and I'm quoting here, "Back in June of 2018, under my leadership," said Director Wray, "we elevated racially and ethnically motivated violent extremism to our highest threat priority on the same level with ISIS and homegrown violent extremists, where it remains to this day." That's one image. The other image is of January 6th, when law enforcement was completely unprepared for the actions of members of the very groups that fit Director Wray's description. So which is it, what the director says or what law enforcement doesn't do that we should be impressed with?
Well, there are a few things here, okay? So first and foremost, I would say historically, we know that kind of law enforcement as an institution, if you will, has indeed been a part of the issues of systemic racism that have affected our society. So let's just recognize that. Let's recognize that it was the Bureau itself that, in the 50s targeted Dr. King and other civil rights leaders and perpetuated, again, some of the manifestations of systemic racism. We still see that today. We have lots of issues in law enforcement. So that is true as a backdrop. I will tell you that the ADL, we've been working with the FBI for generations, like you alluded to. We've worked with them to crack open the KKK, fight neo-Nazi sympathizers very early on in the 20th century. And I think flash forward to today, I found Director Wray, like his predecessors, like Director McCabe and Director Mueller, very aware of the problem and the threat posed by white supremacists. And we can go back to the 1990s. I'm sure you remember covering the bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, which was, before 9/11, the single worst terror attack on American soil committed by a white supremacist, by the way, former military. Mm-hmm. And so I think the FBI has indeed understood the problem and the nature of the threat. I do think there were clearly, I mean, I'm being generous when I say there were clearly communication snafus among different law enforcement agencies around January the 6th. And I say this not in some abstract way, but in a concrete way, because I know we at ADL were briefing law enforcement ahead of January the 6th about what we were seeing. I mean, we monitor these extremist groups, as you alluded to in your introduction, and we were profoundly alarmed because the folks who are gathering, if you will, around and ahead of and promoting the Stop the Steal rally were like a rogues gallery of the far-right extremists in this country. Some of the worst elements out there were all talking openly, not just about converging on the Capitol, as they did, but about physically interfering with the process itself. Yeah. So it's somehow the Capitol Hill Police to the FBI to Arlington and DC and Bethesda County PD and the Secret Service. It honestly, Robert, it is a mystery how that event itself wasn't what they call a national security special event. I mean, as you said, I worked at the White House. I've seen hard perimeters where you secure an event. It is beyond my understanding how that didn't happen here.
Let me ask you one other, not small question before we get to our question and answer session, which is this. We've been talking about what law enforcement should have been prepared for on January 6th, because it ultimately entailed breaking into the Capitol, searching with violent intent, it seemed, killing a Capitol police officer. But having a rally that espouses racist ideas, hateful anti-Semitic ideas, is not a crime. In fact, I remember when my dear friend Scott Simon, NPR reporter, covered the march through Skokie, Illinois, when the American Civil Liberties Union defended the American Nazis' right to have a parade. Where does odious behavior cross the line from we should shun that, we should expose it, people should campaign against that, to the FBI should be infiltrating these groups, and we should be trying to arrest as many of them as we can as soon as they said 1 foot wrong? Where does illegality begin in this one? This question.
Well, this is, I'll start off right up front by saying two things that might sound in contradiction. Look, the ADL is a civil rights organization that is a ferocious defender, if you will, of the First Amendment. I deeply believe so much of the privileges we enjoy in this country, we can attribute to what's granted in the Constitution, like freedom of speech and freedom of expression. At the same time, Robert, let's recognize that freedom of speech is not the freedom to slander people. Freedom of expression is not the freedom to incite violence, nor is freedom of assembly the freedom to assemble around the Capitol with weapons and then literally rampage through the building. And so while I think I will leave it to constitutional scholars to debate sort of the grays about that, I think there was a very clear and compelling case for the authorities, and we just talked about sort of the communication snafus, but the authorities to say, you can have your rally, but you can't have it in such close proximity of a governmental building where there are legislators actually doing the people's work. In fact, you can have your freedom of speech, but you need to do it in a secure area where you won't, again, put life and limb in jeopardy. And when you make threats, like, I don't know, you want to capture and kill the vice president or the speaker of the House and so on and so forth, that actually isn't protected speech by any measure of the law. And that should be interrupted when it happens, and those people should be arrested and prosecuted for making such threats.
Jonathan Greenblatt of the ADL. Stay with us now, and let's bring back Professor Larry Rosenthal and Professor Kathleen Belew, so we can take some of the questions that have been submitted, some before we began and some since we began. There's a question from Don 2, who says, Mr. Greenblatt discussed the nature of law enforcement's perspective on white extremism. Dr. Belew's done lots of research into how prosecution of white extremists changed after the Fort Smith sedition trials. We should explain what those are. Do you think the federal government will try harder to link so-called lone wolf terrorism events to broader white power groups in light of January 6th? Jonathan, do you want to take that first? And perhaps Larry Rosenthal wants to answer as well?
Sure. I'll just say right up front that I think indeed the lone wolf kind of frame or metaphor is apt, because what we've seen, and we haven't even touched on social media and the role that it played in the proliferation, of extremism, which I find incredibly troubling, and the complicity of the companies in allowing that. But that being said, you have certainly seen many of the people who perpetrated crimes. And while we're still trying to understand, Robert, what happened in Atlanta, think the Atlanta crime where 8 people were murdered, including 6 Asian American women.
At the nail salons, yes.
In the nail salons, on the massage parlors, whatever, comes on the heels of prior attacks like in El Paso, where 20 some odd Latinos people were killed, or Pittsburgh, where 11 Jews were murdered in a synagogue, or the Pulse nightclub, and so on and so forth. Those are all perpetrated by individuals we could characterize as lone wolves, who were sort of self-radicalized online, where these ideas, these noxious conspiracies, were algorithmically amplified to them. So I do think law enforcement is, based on my conversations with people at the Bureau and other agencies, are very aware of this problem and are now going to be tracking this with the kind of attention and focus that ISIS and Al-Qaeda radicalizing techniques previously had.
Lawrence Rosenthal, do you want to answer that as well?
Yeah. It's important to understand, in effect, the motivations of the lone wolves. There's the famous Bible of the militia right, which are the Turner Diaries, published in the late 70s, and many of these events. Jonathan alluded to Oklahoma City. That bombing was a copy of something that went on in the Turner Diaries. The point being that since then, there has always been this notion that an individual or an act would be the spark that would lead to the uprising of all the so-called patriots and the lead into what is effectively a civil war, or in 2020 talk, the Boogaloo. So the idea of lone wolves, there is this sense of that, if you think about people like McVeigh, he expected that, or Dylan Roof in South Carolina. So the place of the lone wolf has a kind of honored place in the world of the far right, as I'm going to be the one who will set off the spark, and that motivation is not likely to go away.
And in fact, Kathleen Belew, you write about decisions taken by the militia movement, or however we describe it, to decentralize, to not have a hierarchical structure, to operate as little units or perhaps lone wolves.
Yes, and let me just pause for a second to kind of clean up a little bit of the language that we're using and get us all on the same page. So the militia movement emerges in the late 1980s. It's bigger than the white power movement, and it's somewhat more ideologically diverse. There are people in the militia movement who would not follow white power ideology, although all of it marches together and all of it is oriented around limitations on the federal government or being outright anti-government. Before that, we're looking at the thread of white power activism, which again is Klan, neo-Nazi, skinhead, radical tax resistor, et cetera. And the move towards leaderless resistance, which is cell-style terror, is a deliberate white power decision. It comes in 1983. And the idea is actually, it predates Al-Qaeda and what we know of cell-style terror today, but it's very, very similar. The idea is simply that one or a few activists can act on their own or in concert with other cells for the same goals, but without direct communication with each other and without communication with leadership. And this is important. So they take on this strategy largely because Klansmen are super frustrated with FBI infiltration during the civil rights era. and because they want to make it more difficult to be prosecuted in court. Those prosecutions don't go very well for a lot of reasons, but they do cost a lot of time and money for the movement. They don't like it. The bigger historical legacy, though, of leaderless resistance has been something I think largely unanticipated, but that the white power movement has really valued and has hung on to as a deliberate strategy. And that is that when we look at these acts as individual actions, the movement as a whole disappears from view. So what we get are different stories about singular acts of violence instead of the story about the broad social groundswell that connects everything together and is working in concert. So what we get is this confusion around, I can see why experts like to have a lone wolf category to reflect different paths of radicalization. But I personally think that lone wolf as a phrase should have no place in our journalistic categories, because what it gives us is a whole bunch of reporting that makes it seem like these events don't have anything to do with each other. And then we get a story about El Paso as an act of anti-immigrant violence, Charleston as an act of anti-African-American violence, the Pittsburgh shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue as an act of anti-Semitic violence. They are all those things, right? They are anti-immigrant, anti-Semitic, and anti-Black violence, but they are also white power violence. They are all carried out by people that share an ideology, that share social ties, even if they're online social ties, that share a set of symbols. They share a common worldview, and this does something really important if we put these stories together.
So, ideology is what you're saying here is more important than movement. It's more apt than movement.
Some of both, right? Because even people who are radicalized online, though we can't say that only social movements that have in real life contact count as social movements in the age of COVID, right? I mean, we all have social relationships that are just online right now, like this one. And so this is important because if we put all those stories together, we first of all learn that there is a groundswell. It's not just one shooting here, one shooting there. This is all part of the same problem. And that's how we get people to devote resources to it and think about changes to the law. The other thing that happens is that all of these communities can now realize that they have something in common, that they've been attacked by the same set of ideas. And after January 6th, that's all of us.
Thank you for that. This is a question I'm going to direct to Jonathan Greenblatt and then whoever else wants to comment. But is there a possibility that white supremacy-inspired criminal acts can be defined legally as domestic terrorism? And if so, how would the legal change take place? Would that be federal? Would it be state law? How? And would you favor that? I'll add to that question.
So two things. I'll answer the question about are these acts domestic terror. I first just want to agree with what Professor Belew said. I do think that when we use a lone wolf term, I appreciate your perspective that we shouldn't do that in such a way that it reduces our ability to see the pattern here. What we need to recognize, Robert, is that, again, Charleston, which I think Professor Rosenthal mentioned, Dylan Roof a minute ago, Charleston, Oak Park, Charleston, Charlottesville, El Paso, Pittsburgh, Orlando, these aren't random outliers, if you will. They're data points on a trend line. And we've got to recognize that. Though they may be self-radicalized individuals, they are all emanating from the same singular force, albeit there are variants and dimensions to it. But Professor Belew is just correct. Like we do ourselves a tremendous disservice, and we undermine our ability to create effective policy interventions. We think, oh, it's just some deranged person. It's not. Like this is the product of indeed a movement, which is as real as the ones you were referring to a few minutes ago. Remember Professor Rosenthal, like in the 20s, out of the ashes of the First World War in Germany. So we need to give it that level of concern. Okay. Secondly, are these instances crimes, domestic terror? I believe they are domestic terror. I believe they are hate crimes as well as acts of domestic terror. You don't need a new domestic terror law to recognize them as such. And I actually would go so far as to say, Robert, that there are plenty of ways the existing laws can be used effectively, and law enforcement can leverage their existing authorities to tackle this issue with intention and with effectiveness. The place where I think we are missing laws, Robert, that inhibit our ability to deal with this, bring me back to social media. And I think the kind of monopolistic indifference we've seen from Facebook and Google and Twitter in addressing the issues on their own platform tells me that we need to kind of break a business model which prevents these companies from applying, frankly, Robert, the same kind of moral authority that you did and your bosses did at NPR for decades and decades. You could have allowed the equivalent of Richard Spencer on your broadcast. You didn't. You could have programmed, an armed militia hour on NPR, once a week. You didn't. You didn't do that in part because you had a kind of moral authority. You didn't do that in part because the law wouldn't have allowed you to.
Right.
When something, and these companies don't abide by the same liability standards, Robert, and that has got to change.
But how do you respond to the argument from some of the big Silicon Valley companies that they're not analogous to NPR or to the Washington Post? They're analogous to the telephone company. They're a common carrier, and we don't hold the telephone company responsible for all of the criminal things that people say on telephone.
Entirely correct. I'd love for these companies to choose. Either you're a media company and you can benefit from those multiples, which they do, and you can benefit from those earnings, which they do, and then regulate it as such, or you're a public utility. And then guess what? You get to be regulated as such. And let me tell you, as we all know, how do the telcos act? Well, they have provisions about fair access. They have provisions about pricing. They have provisions about distribution of services. And we have an FCC which regulates them and ensures that those are applied. So pick your poison. Either you're a media company and you need to start be liable as such, or you're a public utility and you need to play by those rules. The problem we have, Robert, is right now, they do a lot of, if you can watch me, this. Right? Well, they claim that a public utility should be regulated, but then they get traded on the public markets like a media company. It's either or. It can't be both and.
Lawrence Rosenthal, I feel it's your turn to say something about this.
So I was struck by the question about domestic terrorism, as you may recall, several months ago, I think last spring, Donald Trump announced that he wanted to designate Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization. I think that in a way opens a door for the new administration to take the same kind of attitude toward the people who brought about and January 6th. It is very encouraging to me from my point of view, from my perspective, the extent to which the Biden administration is actively prosecuting and arresting the January 6th insurgents, or however you want to call them. I think that one thing that's really important to understand is that in the world of this kind of right-wing militia-like extremism, there is a sense, and this goes back to right-wing groups in the 20th century, including fascists and Nazis, that they really believe that the liberal world, things like Blue America, are kind of weak, flabby, and degenerate, and that they are the real tough people. And when the liberal world, or the Biden administration now, comes down heavily on them, they tend to scatter. And I think that the effect of severe prosecution is going to be something which may be enhanced by some kind of doctrine, as it were, of domestic terrorism to deal with them.
Let me ask a question about big media and regulation, let's say. And we can begin either Professor Belew, if you'd like, or Jonathan Greenblatt. Do we know? I just read this week of two more or three more places where the far right now communicates in social media. I'd never heard of these names before, and I won't spread them here. Is it evident that if the biggest platforms, that is the Twitter and Facebook, and I don't know how many more we can put in that category, that if they were not accessible to hate groups, that the communication among such people would be drastically reduced? It's not just being displaced to other sites, but do we know that in fact we're stopping a certain amount of traffic by regulating those big sites? Do the small sites make up for the big ones, is I guess what my question is.
I think that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that exact question, but I do want to say something related from the historical perspective, which is that what we see across time, if you look at the archives of these movements, is that as the technology expands, the groups use the available technology. So we start with a bunch of mimeographed pages, and then it's like photocopies from the grocery store with clip art. And then it's the early internet, like this movement gets on the internet and has social network activism beginning in 1984. So this is not new, but we see a dramatically increasing amount of internet traffic as the internet gets bigger and more powerful and more common. And certainly in the age of coronavirus, things like social media websites have become more central to all of our lives. So it's natural to think it's there. I tend to think that this is a very difficult job we have ahead for a lot of different reasons. One is that even when they want to, and I think that if is a huge, for all the reasons that Jonathan just outlined, this is a huge if about whether the companies want to do this anyway. But the people tasked with regulating hate speech at Facebook are, it's not enough people, it's impossible work, and not for nothing, it's incredibly difficult to sit there and monitor hate speech all day. All of us have done this in some capacity, and we can tell you it's exhausting and really awful. And, like an average person, 20-year-old first job out of college, it would be really excruciating to get that particular desk at Facebook. And there is this other problem. So there's a problem of like how. It's not something that's very algorithmically oriented because the language changes very quick. The coding changes very quickly. And then there's this other problem of if they police it very rigorously on Facebook or Twitter, then we see a flood to other sites like Parler and Gab, and I don't even know what it is now, the 8kun one that I never know how to pronounce. And so I tend to think that the way the internet is, there's no way to ever regulate it off the internet, right? But I think our job here is to make it difficult to communicate. That has historically worked really well to disrupt this group activity, is to just make it difficult. And our other job is to think about what other kinds of changes we need to go with that. I think that white power activism is a problem across many different levels of our society. It's not just a problem of the internet. It's not just a problem of saying lone wolf in newspapers. It's not just a problem of the terror laws, right? It's also a problem. I mean, it is all of that. And then it also has to do with juror education and what kind of resources we're going to have within communities. And are we going to ever have a national conversation about our long history of racial violence and racial inequality? And all of these things are piled onto each other. And I tend to think that the one that goes most closely with the social media problem is the problem of de-radicalization, because there are real people around all of these people being radicalized. But we have a lot of problems even there too, because nobody wants to call the FBI on their child or their student when they see someone going down the rabbit hole into these web spaces. And in many communities, that's the only set of resources we have. You can call your principal or you can call your local FBI field office. And without more de-radicalization resources, I don't know how much good it's going to do to push the problem farther and farther to the fringes of the internet.
Although we should note that after January 6th, tens of thousands of Americans sent in information about their
absolutely.
Mothers, sons, whatever it was, it often.
Yes. And I'm sorry, I should say, like, at the point of criminality, we do see a change. I mean that initial point of like, I saw my child looking
starting
at me
to read the Turner Diaries. What do I do?
Or something. Yeah, exactly. Which is still on Amazon. It's still publicly available all over the place. I actually, Jonathan also has, you should not let him go without telling about their ADL has I'm going to forget, PROTECT. It's an acronym describing this kind of trans-scalar model of solutions that I think is really good for dealing with this.
Well, Jonathan Greenblatt is going to get the last word because we're running out of time, and it's either about that or about the question, what was the question again? It was,
the question about, you push them off to the minor platforms. Is that good? I would build up on something that Professor Belew said, like, listen, more friction is a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I think she talked about de-radicalizing these people. We just need to de-mainstream the ideas in the first place. Yeah. And so kick it off of Facebook and put it on some hard to find app down in the dark web. Like, that is a good thing. You make it harder to find. I think that's perfectly reasonable. These people have the right to say things, again, as long as they don't, violate that. But that doesn't mean they have the right to put their books in Barnes and Noble. That doesn't mean that Facebook has the right to de-emphasize them in the algorithm. Like, those things are long overdue to happen. The Protect plan is, again, to build on what's been said here, Robert. We think there is no silver bullet to solve this problem. It's going to be a long, grueling fight. And it's going to require not just government to sort of save us, but rather a whole of society strategy to start to tackle it, which includes, as she just said, sort of how do you off-ramp, if you will, individuals who become radicalized? How do you educate at all levels of society about what, to use the term, white power activism is, and how dangerous it can be? How do you ensure that law enforcement, you don't have people, spouting QAnon conspiracy theories about Jewish space lasers or whatnot, like in elected office, let alone, in the military and in law enforcement? And just a series of steps that I think we need to take, private sector, civil society, and elected officials at all levels, if we're going to cleanse. And the last thing, you or I think Professor Rosenthal likened to the Germany in the 1920s. Like, I think this moment, we have an opportunity to, as they denazified Germany after the Second World War, to demagify this country right now, and to say that, to draw lines. And I really applaud members of Congress, like Representative Kinzinger would be a good example of that, or Senator, I'm forgetting his name off the top of my head, the junior senator from Utah.
Romney.
Yeah, forgive me, Senator Romney. We need principled politicians on both sides of the aisle who basically say enough. And when that starts to happen, Robert, that's when we can really turn the tide on this problem once and for all.
Well, Jonathan Greenblatt of ADL and Kathleen Belew of the University of Chicago, Lawrence Rosenthal of UC Berkeley, thanks to all three of you for taking part in today's panel. It's been fascinating.
Thank you very much.
I'd also like to send many thanks to Joshua Plout, Nate Bonzani, and Roni Giuliano from American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, and our video and Zoom director, Bobby Grandone. Our program sponsor is the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. It's a 501c3 national charitable organization. It represents, in the United States, Israel's largest hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petach Tikva in Greater Tel Aviv. The website of the group is www.afrmc.org. Join us next month for People versus Technology, Who's Winning, with special guests Professor Sherry Turkle, Nicholas Carr, and Dr. Virginia Heffernan. I'm Robert Siegel, and this has been Global Connections, Navigating the New Abnormal. See you next month. Stay healthy and stay safe.